Hello, my name is Deijenane Santos. I'm a political scientist and a journalist, and I'm going to present to you this class, The U.S. Presence in Brazil, Geopolitics, Culture, and Economy from 1940s to 1960s. We're going to talk about a very interesting period in the history of Brazil and also in the history of the bilateral relations between Brazil and the US. Unfortunately, many people talk about, the history of Brazil, but normally they don't mention this specific part. It's not a topic very much studied. It's not very much covered in the academia. Some few researchers do that, not only in Brazil but also in the US. But it's a very interesting period that is not studied as it should. So I'm bringing it here to present to you this very specific, time in the history of Brazil when there's a very close interaction between the two countries, Brazil and the USA. So we start with the good neighbor policy, which is a kind of policy initiated by Franklin D. Roosevelt. We were still in that period of World War II. And this policy was aimed to ensure hemispheric solidarity against the Axis powers. So the idea was to use, soft power mainly to attract Brazil's support, to the Allied forces. So it would be like Brazil wouldn't fall prey to the Axis power. So the US changed its policy from the big stick policy of the 19th century, like conquering the support of Latin American countries by force, and then they switched to a soft power diplomacy instead of military diplomacy. So we have the creation of the Office of Inter-American Affairs, and the idea was really create this channel of communications between Brazil and the US, or basically not only Brazil, but the whole southern hemisphere. And the idea was pretty much focusing on exchange and direct financial support. So the idea was, okay, we're going to get a cooperation with Brazil using soft power, using diplomacy, using some financial support, given the fact that Brazil was very much poor at the time, and the American dollars would be very helpful. So, given the size of Brazil and the importance of the country in the southern hemisphere, Brazil really stood as the key strategic partner due to its strategic geography, often called the trampoline to victory. So, the idea of using Brazil's, territory as a platform to help the Allied forces in the theaters of war in Europe and Africa was a very much, very, very important thing. So the Americans saw Brazil's cooperation as a very important uh, reality for the victory of the Allied forces. So we have a very interesting scenario during World War II and after, because after World War II ends, Brazil's cooperation with the US keeps giving. So during this time, we can say that the American way, met the Brazilian way. So we have a cultural shift. The Americans, they start welcoming Brazil's cultural ideas. We have Carmen Miranda. She was a Portuguese singer, but she lived her whole life in Brazil. And then she went to the USA as part of this good neighboring policy. And she became an icon. She became a very famous character in the USA. Of course, she was very folkloric and she received a lot of criticism. Um, because Brazilians believed she became Americanized, like she was kind of betrayed the Brazilian culture, but actually she went there and she characterized herself as a very Brazilian thing, like a Baiana, you know, and she became very famous, still an icon to this day in the USA. Of course, with this folkloric side, as I said, and some people saw her from a negative standpoint. And before, the Carmen Miranda phenomenon, we also had, Walt Disney coming here to Latin America to build this kind of connection, researching about characters and some ways of um, presenting Latin Americans, or Latinos to the American audience. And he decides to draw, to create new characters based on characteristics from the Latinos. Like in Brazil, he created the character Jose Carioca, which is a very bon vivant, kind of, malandro, from Rio de Janeiro, and he's the guy who's always, having fun, dancing the samba, never marries his girlfriend, he's always drinking, he's always eating good food, and he doesn't care much about responsibility. So some people would say this is a negative stereotype from the Cariocas. Others would say kind of, shows the Carioca's way of living. The thing is that Jose Carioca became a very famous character representing the Brazilian, way of doing things. And here you have a picture of uh, a very famous, icon from Disney's characters, Donald Duck and Jose Carioca. So it's like a meeting of these two forces, and then instead of a diplomacy enforced, something done by force, we have this idea of a meeting of Brazil and the US through cultural work, and through soft power, let's conquer each other using culture. So the culture of Jose Carioca, Joe Carioca, it's actually Walt Disney putting into practice the American soft power policy for the Latinos, for Latin America. So actually, Disney comes here during World War II. The world is still at war. Like in 1941, he really visited Brazil, Rio de Janeiro, to design, to create, as I said, Jose Carioca. And actually, it was a very, like I say, how can I say, like a very simple way to present the partnership between the two countries, because the Americans didn't want to steer, any uh, problems with the Brazilians. Americans needed Brazil's territory to fight the Axis. At that time, during Getúlio Vargas' government dictatorship, there were some elements in Vargas' government that were pretty much inclined to the side, of the Axis. They were admirers of Nazi Germany and Nazi army. And even Vargas himself was a little bit ideologically inclined now to the Axis. So it was very important to the Americans, to the American government, to get Brazil to its side. And then the impacts of this partnership, okay, between Brazil and the USA, we're going to have the introduction of the exportable American way of life. The Brazilians will be basically invaded by American, customs. And we have, like, for example, during World War II, in cities like Recife in Pernambuco and Parnamirim and Natal, two states of the Northeast um, state region, sorry, and pretty much the culture changed. Even the way people used to dress, they were way more formal before the arrival of American soldiers, and they started they started dressing like American soldiers, like shorts and Bermudas, and it changed the way people used to relate to each other from the moment the American military presence was very strong in Northeast. And as I said, it was like a cultural connection. We had American influence, but also Brazilian influence. It was like a double influencing moment. So we have a globalization of the samba, especially for Carmen Miranda, as I said. She brought Brazilian culture, Brazilian music to the United States, and she became a phenomenon. Since then, there has never been any other Latino artist that could, topple Carmen Miranda, could match her success at that time. And let's remember there was no social media at the time. She was really, really a phenomenon. And then the Americans, they used, animated media as an effective soft power propaganda. It's like, let's get the Brazilian support, but not through military diplomacy, but through soft power, through culture. And that was a thing that really worked well for the Americans. It's important to understand that many people uh, study about World War II, they study about the Brazil's participation, but very few researchers, as I've mentioned, uh, study the importance of the northeastern part of Brazil to the victory of the Allied forces, especially in the South Atlantic. It's important to say that the South Atlantic became a theater of war. Many attacks from U-boats, German submarines against civilian boats, especially Brazilian ones. It was a tragedy, like many civilians lost their lives. And actually, the attacks on Brazilian vessels, civilian vessels, was like the last straw that caused the Brazilian government to declare formally war against the Axis powers because there were too many lives, like more than 600 people were assassinated by U-boat attacks. And other Allied vessels were also attacked. So that the southern part of the Atlantic was a very violent theater of war. And that was really one of the things that made Brazil formally assume a position alongside, the Allied forces. And so we have two very important, very strategic bases, military bases built by the Americans. The Parnamirim Base in the state of Natal and the Recife Base, which was like the headquarters of the Fourth Fleet of the Americans here. So this Parnamirim Base quickly became like the largest U.S. air base outside the American mainland during World War II. Is very important because the Allied forces could use this base to fly, from northeast to Africa and Europe. So it was quite strategic. It was a corridor that was strategic for the Allied troops. It was very necessary for the supplies to Africa and Europe, as I mentioned. And there was a very huge amount of American soldiers here, American civilians too, who worked to help the military. And we also had a very interesting result from that is that the Americans, they create infrastructure that were left for the nordestinos, the northeastern people, so these places were basically very non-advanced, it was a very some parts were kind of rural, and then after the Americans left, not only during the war but after they left, there was a huge modernization process for these cities. Parnamirim and Recife. They became structured. Like Recife, the airport that we still use today, it was basically organized, it was an infrastructure created by the Americans during World War II. So it was a very positive outcome for the people from Northeast. Here we have a photograph, a very famous, very iconic one, where President Franklin D. Roosevelt, the American president at the time, at World War II time, and Getúlio Vargas, Brazilian president, they met in Natal, or actually in the American military base in Natal in 1943. And in these conversations, they actually formalized even more their partnership. Brazil wanted some American support for their modernization. It's important to say that Vargas remained kind of neutral until 1942. He was trying to bargain both sides. Brazil had a very large commercialization with the Germans. So Brazil didn't want to lose the partnership, the commercial partnership with the Germans. And some elements in Vargas' government, they were pro-German, and they liked, the way the military, German military acted. So it was quite complex because some elements in the Vargas government, including himself, they had some inclinations towards the Axis powers, but Vargas maintained a kind of neutrality until 1942 when he really declared war, basically because of the attacks on Brazilian vessels. And he saw an opportunity to side with the US and also get some support from the US, especially for the um, industry, Brazil's industry, heavy industry that wasn't a reality until then. And the Americans actually helped with that and also modernized the military in Brazil. It was a very strategic and positive partnership for both sides, and Brazil really got some good results by siding with the Americans in World War II. So when you think about the end of World War II, we also think about the beginning of another type of war, which was the Cold War from 1947 onwards. And this moment of the Cold War, Brazil's alignment with the United States will be even more like closer. And so you have three strategic points here: the security, ideological policy, and economy. So Brazil formally severs, its ties, its diplomatic ties with the Soviet Union in 1947. There is a persecution of the Communist Party in Brazil, for example. They go underground. And this severing of diplomatic ties will signal a clear hemispheric alignment with the United States. Brazil is showing they will side with the Americas in the Cold War. And as I've mentioned, the Communist Party will go underground, will not be recognized as a party, and we're going to have a very strong, very big ideological pressure, okay, for this party, for the communists in general. And in the economy, with this alignment with USA, Brazil's economy will open local markets to US consumer imports and actually is going to deplete some of Brazil's wartime reserves. Let's remember that in the end of the 40s, the 1940s, the beginning of the 1950s, Brazil was not very much an industrialized country in a good way. Brazil was starting to, strengthen its very young industry. So it was very common to have a country with Brazil's profile as a partner of the US, receiving a lot of US products, especially knowing that Brazil didn't have the quality of production that the Americans had at the time. So Gaspar Dutra's alignment with the US, it's a very important point in this historical period of after World War II and the beginning of the Cold War. And as you can see, there is a rise of multinationals in Brazil from the 1950s onwards, which is a very interesting thing because it means that Brazil's market, Brazil's economy was really opened for the foreign capital, and it would bring Brazil's society, people would have access, would bring them access to products that the national industry was not very much able to produce. So there is a boom in the multinationals presence in Brazil in the 1950s. That's a very interesting phenomenon, and it really shows how Brazil's economy was, getting into the international market, and Brazil becomes this country where imports, products from other countries are very much a reality. Let's not forget that during the 1950s, the president of Brazil, Juscelino Kubitschek, who was elected with a program where he would call like 50 years in 5, he wanted to bring modernity. He wanted to bring Brazil to the avant-garde of nations. And he really invested, he heavily invested on automotive, plants. The idea was to bring this modernity to transportation. So Brazil embraced the automotive plant as the ultimate symbol of industrial progress. There are some criticisms around that still to this day, that Brazil kind of invested so heavily in the auto industry and in roads to connect Brazil, and the transportation was mainly a kind of a connection to this whole country, which is a very big country. So the main transportation was basically the car, the truck to deliver products, that to this day, that's a real problem to Brazil because there was no investment as it should in other kinds of transportation. Like Brazil has many rivers that could take vessels as a means of transportation. The trains, the tracking of trains actually was something that was basically destroyed. So train as a transportation for cargo, it's almost it's so not what it should be. Brazil should have used this possibility to create other routes, other ways for cargo transportation. So railroads in Brazil are so inferior, as a way of transportation. That's actually a sad thing. Brazil is heavily dependent on cars, heavily dependent on roads. So it's not a good thing when your only means of transportation is basically the car and the road. So if the truck drivers, truck union decides to have a strike, there you have it. There will be absolutely no way to get your products at home. The cargo transportation in Brazil depends heavily on the road and the car as a means of transportation, and that comes from the time of JK, JK, Juscelino Kubitschek, when he was president in Brazil in the 1950s. Well, if during World War II, there was this kind of cooperation between the US and Brazil, the soft power diplomacy, the cultural exchange. From the 1960s onwards, the situation was a little bit different. There is actually a program called Alliance for Progress, a program created by the Kennedy administration, John Kennedy. Kennedy was very worried about what could happen in Latin America, in the southern part of the hemisphere, because in 1959 there was the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro took power in that island, and what happened there, a kind of socialist, Marxist, communist revolution, could happen elsewhere. So the Kennedy administration really made, this situation a very strong point of his administration. It became a topic of high, importance in Kennedy administration, in Kennedy's administration, because he really could define the side, okay, of Brazil, for example, other countries, but especially Brazil. Brazil was the main country that worried the American administration because there was a real risk that Brazil could side with this movement and turn Brazil into a second Cuba. And why was the administration so much sure that that was a real possibility? Because at the time in Brazil, but especially in Northeast, the state of Pernambuco, for example, or Paraíba, there was a movement where the communists, were really, tracking and getting support, especially from peasants. It was a very hard situation when it comes to the lives of peasants in the state of Pernambuco, for example, or in the state of Paraíba. And in the 1950s, there was an organization. This organization was created to defend the interests of these peasants who lived like slaves. Let's be sincere. It was the men with great property, landowners who had lots of peasants working for them. Sometimes these people had a place for them to plant, so they had to work and they had a piece of land for themselves, but it was actually a complete, poverty. And these people had no rights, basically. They earned almost nothing. All they could earn, they had to buy in the grocery store from the landowner. So it was a complete slave, enslavement situation. And in the 1950s, there was the creation of the Ligas Camponesas, or peasant leagues. It was very strong in Pernambuco and also in Paraíba. And then they were basically co-opted, co-opted um, um, by Marxist elements. There was Francisco Julian, who was a leader. He was a lawyer, he was a politician, but he was also a leadership, a Marxist leadership, and he was really engaging with the peasants. So there were, the conservative forces, political forces in Pernambuco, basically landowners, industrialists and all that. And on the other side, there was this Marxist movement. So Kennedy's government sent a lot of people here. It was a time in the 1960s where you had lots of Americans here, journalists and political commentators, historians. People came here to study this environment that looked like a microcosmos of the Cold War. So there was this two, there were these two forces: the conservatives, pro-American forces, and the Marxists, pro-Soviet Union and Cuba. So there was a huge fear in Washington regarding Brazil, siding with Cuba and a new Cuban revolution. For example, Leonel Brizola, which was a leadership also, he was from the Workers' Party, let's say, Partido Trabalhista Brasileiro, PTB, and he was also a force against USA. There were some expropriations, during his time as a leadership in Rio Grande do Sul, his state. And there was really a climate of, uh, division, let's say, people that were pro-American, people that were pro-Soviet Union, and this kind of conflict was really strong, ideologically speaking, here in Pernambuco. So the way the Americans they will find a way to keep Brazil under surveillance, to interfere in Brazil, the way they're going to find it's through the Alliance for Progress. So this initiative will be the means used by the American administration to keep an eye on Brazil. So it was a massive program designed actually to counter socialist influence after the Cuban Revolution. It was disguised as this kind of, funding for public health, primary schools, basic infrastructure. Let's remember Brazil was still very poor. While I live in Recife, the capital of Pernambuco, and I can see the Alliance for Progress, from a very practical perspective. There's really like a school that was built with the help of the money from the Alliance for Progress during Miguel Arraes, government. Miguel Arraes was also a very famous character that was against the American interference here. And when he was governor, there was the construction, the building of a. They built a school, and the name of the school is Eleanor Roosevelt. It was built in 1962 with Kennedy administration support. So that's a physical proof of the presence of Americans here. During the 1960s, there were like a lot of Americans here, American personnel, the American consulate. I think it was around 3,000 personnel. And they had to build a school, the American school that still works today, to this day, to receive the children from these American personnel. As I said, it was a place full of smart people, people from journalists, people from the New York Times. There was a lot of articles, pieces in famous news outlets, and there was also a very clear interest in this region. Now, many people came for their gap year. They came to study, the situation in Pernambuco. Like Ralph Nader. We have also Robert Page, who was an author at the time, and then after he became a professor, university professor, but he was an author here, and he wrote The Revolution That Never Was, and he really documented everything that was happening during the 1960s. It's a fantastic book. It was translated to Portuguese by Ariano Suassuna, which was one of Brazil's greatest writers. And this program, Alliance for Progress, was a program that disguised the real intention of the Americans, which was to keep an eye on Brazil. And then they focused on Northeast. It was the poorest area in Brazil, still is, with parts of the North too. North and Northeast are the poorest areas in Brazil. And that was a priority from this administration. Let's not forget about Cuba. And let's try to avoid Pernambuco, especially Pernambuco, from getting, a second Cuba here. So it was a very strategic initiative from the Americans because they truly believed that there was a high risk of Pernambuco, Northeast in general, but Pernambuco especially becoming a second Cuba. And then there is a very important thing also, because the Alliance for Progress was very focused on basically Northeast, but it also happened in some other parts of Brazil, like in Rio de Janeiro. There is to this day the Villa Kennedy or Kennedy Village was built with the money from the Alliance for Progress. Here next to my neighborhood, there is a kind of a square, a park called Robert Kennedy, and it was named after President Kennedy's brother, one of his brothers. And then also, together with the tensions in Northeast, there is also tensions between Kennedy and João Goulart. João Goulart was Brazil's president before the military coup in 1964. His government was pretty much polemic, very complex, because he tried to talk to the poor, the workers, and at the same time, he was very much feared in Washington because he had kind of a, you know, this connection with, socialist or Marxist, ideologies. So he wanted to do the reformas de base, base reforms, which would be connected to um, changing the reality of poor people and the workers, especially peasants. So he wanted to have reforms. He wanted to redistribute, lands, farms that were really huge. The big latifundio, the great lands, big lands, big territories. He wanted to redistribute that and give pieces of land to peasants. So one of the things about him is that he had a very independent foreign policy. So he talked to the Americans, but he sought diplomatic ties with Eastern Bloc countries, um, and remember I mentioned his brother-in-law, um, which was a very much critic. He was very critical of the USA, Brizola, and Brizola really didn't like the idea of American companies getting profit here. So there was the profit remittance law that Goulart introduced. Caping the amount of capital multinationals could send home. Like you cannot send the whole profit or much of it. We have to stay with something. And actually, that was a thing that the American administration feared about Goulart because he was very close to peasants and very close to the working class. So he wanted land reform, basically. And that was something that the Americans didn't want. And Goulart, he faced a very serious moment when Brazil changed its political system from presidential, okay, to parliamentary. So Brazil had a moment where it was not a presidential system but a parliamentary one, and he lost his powers as president. The parliament was stronger. It didn't work, of course. Brazil came back to presidential system, but it was a way that the opposition tried to make him lose support, to keep him at bay. So it didn't work, of course, in the end. But right after, there was the military coup. So his government was really, really a government that represented in a very strong way the divisions in Brazil at the time, the forces that were pro-American, that were helped by Americans, and the forces that were, nationalists, people with that were leaning towards, socialism, Marxism, and Goulart, and also his brother-in-law um, were very much, Leonel Brizola were very much pro-workers, and that was something that bothered Washington. And it's very interesting that, as I've mentioned already, many people came to Northeast, to Pernambuco, to get to know, to come to see in loco, to see what was going on. And Kennedy's brothers, they came here. In the first picture, there is Ted Kennedy. He was visiting Northeast. This is a photo in Caruaru, a city from here, and he was on the side of the mayor of the city at the time. And later, really, this was in 1961, and later, after John Kennedy's assassination in 1963, his brother, Bob Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, who was trying to understand what was going on here, he also came to visit Pernambuco. So the Kennedy brothers were pretty much aware of the situation in Northeast. Actually, the visit from Bob Kennedy was in 1965, so it was after Kennedy's death, assassination, his brother John Kennedy, and after the coup in Brazil, the military coup, which happened in 1964. But Brazil was still a place that interested the United States. And then it shows how Northeast was pretty much a place that worried the Americans. So after this period where the Alliance for Progress tried to get support from Brazilians, especially people from Northeast, the politicians there was a real interference from the Americans in the election process, in the forces, the conflict between forces there, especially in Pernambuco. After the very complicated mandate from João Goulart, okay, where there was a division between pro-American forces and pro-nationalist or socialist forces, his government was pretty much a conflictuous one. Then you have American support for Operation Brother Sun, and this operation will help the ones who are going to be behind the military coup. So the Operation Brother Sun was a direct U.S. backing of the military coup that ousted President João Goulart. So it was like the Americans saying, we are supporting that, okay? And the Americans tried to do that through naval presence, fuel and logistics, and diplomatic support. So when the coup was going on, there were aircraft carriers and fuel tankers dispatched to the Brazilian coast in case it was needed. There was readiness to ship fuel and munitions to support the rebel forces if there was any necessity, and also immediate recognition of the military regime by Washington. So what did the Americans do? Throughout the 1960s, through the Alliance for Progress, okay, there was a kind of a veiled action, a veiled acting. The Americans used a program to help with infrastructure, the construction of schools and all that. Apparently a social, program to disguise the real intention that was like keeping Brazil under control so that Brazil wouldn't turn into a second Cuba, which would represent way more problems to the Americans in the context of the Cold War. But with Operation Brother Sun, it was the open support. There was no hiding. It was an open support for the coup, a military coup in Brazil that ended João Goulart, government. He was democratically elected. He couldn't have been ousted. And then Brazil will start a moment that goes from 1964 to 1985, where there was a military government, a military junta. It was a mixture of military and civilian governments, but it was a coup that would change Brazil in a very complex way. And then we end this moment of America's, interaction with Brazil in a very negative and tragic way. So from those moments during World War II, where there's real cooperation and was really necessary, and it was really positive for both sides because they fought together with the Allied forces against the Axis powers, and Brazil also received a lot of help support from the Americans to modernize its economy, to modernize its infrastructure. And then during the 1950s with Juscelino Kubitschek, there was an opening for Americans, and for American capital in Brazil. But this 1964 support for the military coup in Brazil kind of ends this moment of cooperation between Brazil and USA. The connection between the two countries will keep strong, but in different ways. There'll be moments during the military government that Brazil will have difficulties keeping its connections with USA in a traditional way, and Brazil will seek other partners, and it's a very complex moment too. So we finished this class. My idea was just bringing, to bring some information about the connection between Brazil and the USA during the 40s, 50s, and 1960s, and especially mentioning this period from the 1960s that's not too much studied, not too much researched, which is a shame. It's a pity. It's such an interesting moment and such a defining moment between USA and Brazil, and I think it should be more, talked about. So thank you very much for your attention on this matter, and I hope I can talk to you about other topics regarding Brazil and the USA, and I will finish with this sentence from Juraci Magalhães, Brazil ambassador to the US. What is good for the United States is good for Brazil. And then as a legacy, we have a heavily industrialized but financially dependent economic system alongside a strict Cold War geopolitical alignment that structured the military regime. So this is kind of the context of what happens from the moment the Americans support the military coup and what actually happens during the military regime. So Brazil becomes, a country that still, presents itself as a dependent in the economy area, a country dependent on the international market. And I think that during the Cold War and during the military regime, Brazil will really struggle to keep this connection, this historical connection with the USA, and at the same time distancing itself, from the Americans trying to pursue an independent diplomacy, which the military governments will try to do at some points. Okay, so thank you very much, and I hope we can talk about other topics related to Brazil and USA cooperation or relations, diplomatic relations in the future. Thank you very much.